Okay. So we are putting this session on recording so that this may be useful for your for your class fellows who are unable to attend this session for any reason. Okay, and I'll put this recording on LMS. Um, Eamon was telling me that some of you have not got your LMS, and those who have got the LMS, they have some difficulty in um, accessing my portal and the book that I have uploaded there. Okay, you could log in and you could not find my book. Okay, I think you just need to download the book. I have put the book there from my Google Drive. You just need to download it. The other method can be that I email the book to your CR. We'll just see if that can be done. Okay, we can it's okay if we have to move to the older method. Previously also we used to email our reading material to the students, so we'll move to the older method, but it's important to go with the technology. You should know how to operate your LMS. That's quite official, and it's easier for me to just put my things there, and you just download it from there. So how many of you are with a book today? If I put this question, just let me put it in the chat also. Okay, you need guidelines to use LMS. We as faculty had a training for LMS, how to work with LMS. I do not know how the students would be facilitated in using of this LMS. Anyway, let's start our lecture today. Yesterday we had an introductory session about what is the course of LTM, language teaching methodology, what you can expect and what would be the outcome. Okay, the outcome of this course is really significant, and this course basically aims at making effective language teachers, just not teachers but the actual language teachers who would be able to, in our particular context, teachers who would be able to teach English as a second language. We talked about methods. We are going to talk about approaches and techniques also today, and we would look at some of the ongoing methods. Maybe, as I told you, that maybe they are proven not to be very effective, but in certain situations, such as ELT situation in Pakistan, they are still working. For instance, the grammar translation method. Okay. Now, before we begin, in the first 3 minutes, I would like you to put your homeworks in the chat section. Your homework was to differentiate between approach, method, and technique. Okay. I hope you are listening to me and you would be putting down your homeworks here. These all work towards one aim. Okay. So I don't know how many of you have done the homework. One more thing is, you know, you need to take responsibility of your own learning. We as teachers cannot check every time that you're reading or you are doing your homeworks or you are visiting your LMS, you are downloading your material, you are staying in touch with what is happening in the course. So you need to take your own responsibility. Okay. Whatever is assigned to you, please come read to the class, right? So until and unless this is a different, of course, this is a different learning and teaching method, and all of us are experiencing it, or most of us are experiencing it for the first time, this online teaching. So it's important that you behave responsibly and do what you are asked to do. Okay, so in the first three minutes you'll be putting your homeworks on the chat. Let me check, let me have an idea what is your understanding of these three different terms, which works towards one single aim. Okay. Right. Most of you have worked with methods and not with the techniques and approach. Okay. Got it. Okay, I got it. Many of you have at least tried to. Some of you are correct, some of you are not correct, but most of you are, at least tried to read about approach, technique, and method. That's wonderful. Okay, now let's move on. Um, Whenever we would be talking about language teaching methodology, whatever methodology we would talk about, we will look at its approach, how it came into being, what is the theoretical underpinning behind it, how this has been actually reached, how the method has actually been approached. Okay, and then through that approach we go to the method, and in order to implement that method we use certain kinds of techniques, and in language teaching these techniques refers to certain kind of exercises and drills also. So let's look at how these are actually differentiated terms. There is a little difference, but all of them help in developing a single methodology. Okay, so let's talk about approach. Now, approach reflects to a certain model of research paradigm. Research, by when we talk about research and when we talk about paradigms, we talk about the theories, the theoretical underpinning of these methodologies, right? So when we talk about approaches, so we talk about certain perspective of researchers. How do they look at a methodology, how a methodology is constructed with the help of certain theories. All right, so for instance, what are some of the psycholinguistic theories we have? I've given you the example of behaviorism. Okay, stimulus response chain, right? Now there is a method by the name of audiolingual method, right? It's about repetition. When people repeat, they learn the language. Okay, and this method is also in practice at many of the educational institutions, especially the schools and sometimes the language centers in our country, right? So it is basically, the approach is about repetition. um, if you give a stimulus to a person, he would respond, and there would be a single response. There would be nothing between the stimulus and response. This is what behaviorism is. So this is one of the approaches through which different methodologies have been constructed. Okay, Now, coming to the method refers to procedures. When we say that we have followed a certain method in the classroom, we are saying how did we go about teaching, how did we start, what did we do first, right? So when we are making lesson plans, we are actually making the method of doing it. Okay, what would be the method, what would we do first? Would we introduce some element of the language first? Would we start with certain examples? Would we start with certain drills, some exercises? So all this plan, all this procedure that actually is pre-planned in most of the language classrooms is called as the method. Okay, methods is how to teach a second or a foreign language. And the method is compatible with the approach, right? As I have given you, let me add some of the members are waiting, let me add them. Now, this method has to be compatible with the approach. As I have given you the example of behaviorism, stimulus, response, repeat. Okay, so any method that is formulated or that takes up the approach of behaviorism, or that takes up the theoretical underpinning of behaviorism, would suggest the method would work on repetitions. Okay, you give a stimulus, you will get the same response, you will not get another response. Though there has been debates on failure of such theories and the methods that are based on these, but still I told you that these are in practice. Anyway, what I want to tell you is how a method needs to be connected to the approach. A method is just not a random thing. Okay, it has to be compatible with the approach that it takes, right? So in foreign language teaching, you can have a methodology that is just not based on one approach. It can take one or two approaches. Okay, and that's fine if you take a combination of approach to make a method. Now, what is technique? Technique is actually what the approach and the method is with the teacher. Okay, you are the one who would decide which method, and of course it has to be compatible with the approach. Only you know which approach you have taken and which method you are going to follow. Okay, now technique is what the students are going to experience. Okay, in technique we include the classroom activities. These can be exercises, these can be drills also. Okay, now these are also devised according to the method. For instance, as I have given you example, if you are working with, for instance, if you are working with grammar translation method, we will have a separate class on each of this method, but just for the sake of examples, grammar translation method. Now in grammar translation method, what the teacher does is, whatever she says in the second language, for instance, in our case, English language, she is going to translate into the native language of the child or of the students, right? Or she's going to translate into the lingua franca of that particular community. For instance, Urdu is not the native language of most of us. Okay, but it happens to be a lingua franca. Do you know what is lingua franca? Please put it in the chat. What is lingua franca? And any term that you do not understand in my lecture, please do ask. You have an option of raising your hand. You do not be raising your hand just like that. But if you want to want to say something, I can unmute you. Okay. Right. People can open your chat. Your class fellows are answering, and most of them, I think, are correct. This is the language of communication. So I was giving you an example of how these are related. So if you have taken up the method, grammar translation method, so what would be the activity, the related technique would be to give translations to the students. Such activities and questions are still in practice in our matriculation and intermediate exams also. The system that most of us have come from, still translations are a question there, right? So the drill, now this this translation activity of translating word by word or sentence, this really depends how you have actually practiced grammar translation method in the classrooms. So you will design the similar kind of activities in order to apply that method in the classroom, in order to teach through that method. Now, if you are taking up any other method like direct method, audiolingual methods, Suggestopedia, communicative language approach, they don't have anything to do with the translation, okay? The method is such that when you take up the technique of teaching through those methods, translation has nothing to do, okay? This is how method has to be compatible with approach, and technique has to be compatible with the method. You cannot take the translations to the audiolingual method, or you cannot take the translations to the direct method, okay? So, and grammar translation and direct method are of course opposite to one another. In direct method, there is no room for translation or using of mother tongue or using of the native language, right? So all of these work towards the similar goal, which is to teach a language, okay? Right. So basically, method is the procedure, and techniques are the activities, classroom activities. That can be dictation also, repetition, imitation. All of these can be, activities for teaching of a language. Excuse me. Okay. Okay. Now coming to the approaches, I told you that coming to the approaches, I've already told you that it has to do with the theories of the language. Now, there can be a number of theories, but basically, when it comes to language teaching, we follow two approaches. Okay, there are two theories towards language teaching, or the approaches that we take. Basically, there are two, right? Now, one is the structural view of the language. It's structure view, there's a difference between form and function of the language. Let's put it this way, okay? Structural view is related to the form of the language, right? What is the structure of the language? How the language is approached? What is the syntactical structures of the language and how those should be taught? When we are taught grammar separately, as most of us have learned grammar formally, what we are doing while we are teaching or learning grammar, we are actually learning the structure of the language. That's the structural view. So this is one of the views of teaching and learning of language, that language can be learned through learning of its forms, okay? For instance, we have learned the tenses of English as a second language. We have learned active passive of the language. We have learned the syntactic structure. SVO is the syntactic structure of English sentences. So all of these are only forms. They don't have a function, okay? Now, the function of the language starts when it gets in a certain context, right? I hope you understand what is context. What do you mean by context? Can you just put it here in the chat? What is context? When I say that the form moves to functionality of the language when it is put in a certain context. Okay, Minal says that this is a situation. Yes, that's right. Someone else? Quickly, so that we can move forward. Okay, setting or situation. Yeah, that's the context. There are a number of things that come in the context. It's really the background knowledge of the participants, it's the participants themselves, it's the time, it's the place. Many things form the context. Anyway, so while we are talking about the approaches, so there's a structural view through which most of us have learned language, right? We are more proficient in the forms. Okay, our language is more correct than being fluent. Okay, this is because the way we are taught language, we are actually made proficient in the form of the language. As soon as you're given a sentence, if I ask you what tense is used, you can tell me what tense is used. So in this structural view of language, or which refers to teaching the forms of a language, the forms are approached. What happens is language is taught away from the context. Okay, for instance, when you are taught English language through this approach, through the structural approach, or through the structural view of the language, what does the teacher do is she writes down 10 sentences. Okay, for instance, if she's teaching direct indirect, she would write down 10 segregated sentences on the board and would ask you to convert those to indirect speech. Now those sentences are not linked with one another, and they don't have a context. Okay, because those sentences are self created. Those sentences are only there to teach you the forms through the structural approach of the language. Okay, so some of the methods, basically the initial language methodologies or the initial language methods in the history of language teaching, are based on the structural view, right? And many of the linguists, now that we have moved to the communicative approach, they believe that teaching through the forms of the language is not really functional, in the sense that you also have observed that even after 16 years of education in English language, our students are not proficient. This is because they have learned the forms and not the function of the language. Okay, so the second view, that is the functional view of the language, and which is becoming really popular in language teaching, and many of the language centers have adopted it. They talk more about it, about fluency than accuracy. Okay, I hope you know the difference between fluency and accuracy. What's the difference between being fluent or being accurate? Are these two different things? Let me put it in the chat. Oh, it's going to Fiza Batul. Sorry, I have to send it to everyone. Yes, Amen is right to a certain extent. Yes, lot of people are not participating. in answering the question, I don't know if you are there or you do not know the answer. Anyway, we need to continue, okay? Okay, now, usually the focus of teaching of forms through the structural view is accuracy. And the aim of teaching the second language, uh, in our context, we always talk about English as a second language, so let's put English. So the functional view of teaching English as a second language targets the fluency of the students. It enables students to, speak, right? And this is what is being focused in the lately developed method or the modern kind of teaching language methodologies. Their focus is more on fluency rather than on accuracy. Okay. Now, this functional view teaches the communicative meaning and the actual use of language in certain situations. For instance, if you have come across the books that are used or the reading material or the teaching material that is used in language centers, you must have come across that they create situations. They do not teach language out of the context. For instance, they will give you a conversation when two friends are meeting. Okay, they teach how to greet in a certain culture through a certain language. They tell you how to converse, how to end a conversation in a certain situation, and they actually give you situation. It's a party situation, it's a wedding situation, while you are in school, while you are in the market. Then they teach you communication between a salesman and the person who is buying things, the customer and the salesman. They give you such kind of dialogues that put the language in context. So this is the functional view of language, and this functional teaching, the functional teaching through the functional view of language is the modern way of teaching language, and this is more useful for the learners too. Okay, so logically speaking, there is no use if someone knows the grammar but she or he is unable to communicate. Language is all about communication. When someone is unable to communicate in a language, language teaching